Thank you all for coming today to listen to me ramble about screech owls and bioacoustics. These are the things I love talking about, and so whenever I have an opportunity to chat with a nature group or a local community group, ideally both, it's always an absolute pleasure. So thank you all for basically volunteering your time to hear about these animals. To start with, this is a question I love to ask myself all the time, because I find myself very much interested in the night. And the question that has driven a lot of the research that I've done is, what can we learn from listening to it? What can we learn from listening to the night? To the organisms, the lack of organisms, to what the organisms are saying, to when the organisms are saying it, what is it telling us? And the exciting part of that for myself, and I think for a lot of people who are interested in nocturnal ecology, is that there's not the same associated visual signals at the same time. So it is just what you hear for the most part. It's not necessarily what you see. So on the right here, we have a few species that you might have an opportunity to study or to interact with at night just by listening. Western Screech Owl up top, and halfway down you have your marbled murrelet. They come in and out around dawn and dusk and at night from their breeding sites in old growth spruce and similar habitats along the coast, and then Pacific chorus frogs, which you can't avoid in the springtime sometimes at night, trying to listen past them, especially for screech owl surveys. Before I go any further in this presentation, I do want to talk a little bit about collaborations, and I know you guys did a land acknowledgement. I'd also like to say that I'm presenting here from the traditional unceded territory of the Snuneymuxw Nation in Nanaimo, and we're also collaborating with a number of other nations and Indigenous groups across coastal BC. We've been lucky enough to work with the Kwantlen Nation and the Heiltsuk Nation. The Heiltsuk Nation in particular was a big help in starting all of this work up on the Central Coast during my honors thesis. And a number of other nations across Vancouver Island, and that list is continuing to grow as we start to interact with the people who are on the land and who know the land better than anybody who could helicopter in and do a survey and leave again. So this is a big part of who we are as an organization, even before I've told you what our organization's name is. This is a part of who we are as a group and what we do. So the owl of interest here that I've been listening to the night for so long to find is the Western Screech Owl. Many of you know what a Western Screech Owl is, but I'll go through this with a brief species description for those of you who don't. This is a young Western Screech Owl that my grandfather found on a small island just south of Nanaimo called Whaleboat Island. And this island's about 100 meters across and almost perfectly round. And it had a Western Screech Owl nest that had been broken in half from a windstorm when an arbutus cavity that had screech owl nestlings in it snapped off, and all the young came pouring out. And in classic Farley Mowat, Owls in the Family narrative, he found that there was one live Western Screech Owl and all the other ones had perished. So he picked the owl up, brought it home with him. Before he brought it home, he actually had to continue his sailing trip. So he sailed with it for a while and became known as the guy with the sailboat and the owl who ate everything at cocktail parties. So this Western Screech Owl made its way to Lasqueti, Texada, and then all the way back down to Vancouver, where it was sent to a rehab owl. I'm trying to remember what it was called. I was trying to call it WRA, but it's not. It's Orphan Wildlife Rehabilitation in Delta. And they sent that bird off to this Sunshine Coast afterwards once it had recuperated. So this was my first introduction to this species, and it was an absolutely amazing species that I never got to encounter again from the time I was 12 to the time that I was 25. But I looked for it all 13 years in between. And what I learned while I was searching was that Western Screech Owls, the ones that are on our coast anyway, are part of the subspecies Kennicoti. The other Screech Owls we have in BC, Western Screech Owls, are in the interior of British Columbia, and they're known as McFarlane or McFarlanei. And the Kennicoti subspecies goes from Southern Oregon all the way up to the Alaska, almost to the Panhandle in some cases. Sorry, past the Panhandle, almost to the Aleutians in some cases, where some birds have sort of popped up up past Anchorage, but all along the Panhandle and up to sort of South mainland Alaska. And we're right in the middle, the core part of their range, Vancouver Island and Vancouver, the lower mainland. Chilliwack is interesting because it's not very far east of there. You start to get behaviors and habitat that's not dissimilar from what the McFarlanei subspecies lives in. And so people have sort of questioned where that line, that boundary of the Kennicoti subspecies and the McFarlanei exists. And it seems like there's actually quite a bit of integration there. And you kind of just get to choose where you want to put it. Yeah, but Chilliwack, it would be a Kennicoti subspecies, Western Screech Owl. Here's just a closer view of what the range looks like along the coast. And even though it looks like they're separated here, the McFarlanei, it's very much continuous in river valleys in the Okanagan all the way to the coast. So one of the things that people have sort of been interested in for a long time is Western Screech Owl breeding habitat. Because they're a resident species, we find their breeding habitat, you more or less find their wintering habitat, even though they expand their home ranges in the winter and they start to forage further, presumably when there's a lot less food available. And in the breeding season, they shrink their home ranges around. But these birds can find their nest, they'll find their habitat. And what they seem to like is low elevation, riparian, so adjacent to different types of water bodies, mostly rivers and creeks, deciduous and mixed deciduous forests. So typically in the Okanagan, what you're going to think of is these big cottonwood forests, and then out on the coast, alder and maple. And that's what they like, and mixed in with some conifers sometimes. This is a good example of some mixed conifer alder forest at one of the locations that we were at this spring. Additionally, what you can get from this photo here from Jess on the Gulf Islands in this amazing arbutus cavity is that they're cavity nesters. And so they need older trees or nest boxes to be able to reproduce. And often they use them to roost as well, but they need these old, typically very old trees that are dead and have primary excavators like pileated woodpeckers and hairy woodpeckers to build their cavities for them. What else do they need? Well, a lot of people think that small owls eat mice, and typically they do. So if you were looking at a boreal or a saw-whet owl, a lot of their diet is going to be composed of things like deer or Keen's mice on the coast. Except if you're looking at species, the subspecies on Haida Gwaii, that's for saw-whets. They do very different things. But for the most part, you think they eat mice. Western Screech Owls do eat a lot of mice. Unfortunately, or fortunately, if you have a bunch of pellets to go through, but fortunately, if you're a Screech Owl, they can eat just about anything they want that's smaller than them. So they've been recorded eating worms and birds, from robins to kinglets, chickadees, some of the only data on the central coast around Bella Bella for diet includes one bird that had entirely caterpillars, assumed bagworm larvae, which are this one up here on this cedar or this cypress, where they cover themselves entirely in casings. And so their pellet was full of little caterpillar bits and a bunch of vegetation, because the ratio of vegetation to caterpillar in a bagworm larva case is very high. So this animal had nothing else in its pellets. And some of the older evidence from the 1940s, when bird watching involved just shooting everything you saw, were some nestlings and some adults with gunnels, intertidal fish from the coast in their stomach, which means they would presumably have to have either been foraging in the water or along the shore at low tide and reaching under rocks to grab them. There were enough that it was not just sort of a momentary thing. They presumably were targeting them. So it's really interesting. They have these specific times where they eat one thing, and then it seems like sometimes they'll eat a whole bunch of different stuff. So they're very versatile. They love frogs, they love birds, they love mice, they love insects. Now, one thing you'll notice is that you're not seeing Western Screech Owls either anymore, or maybe you've never seen Western Screech Owls in your local neighborhoods. Historically, in the Lower Mainland and up the Fraser Valley, that was the most common owl, period. It was more common than any other owls in the area. But in the 1970s and 80s, they started to apparently decline, and were functionally extirpated, so eliminated from that area almost entirely, from southern Vancouver Island, around Victoria, Nanaimo, most of the southern Gulf Islands, Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Fraser Valley, by the from early 2010s. And you can see this is a Christmas bird count plot here plot from a Christmas bird count data, birds per party hour, and these are the years here. So this is sort of an encounter rate, and it's declined, and it has continued to decline since 2014, more or less. So if they eat just about anything, and they live in these sort of mixed deciduous coniferous forests, which there seem to be a lot of around, especially places like Aldergrove, Chilliwack, these areas in the Fraser Valley where you have alder pops up almost entirely as the first successional species, and then maple. Why aren't we seeing them around? I've neglected to put a barred owl slide in here, but imagine this one's a barred owl. One of the expectations is for Western Screech Owl declines has been barred owls, which are a larger, heavier owl, a little bit smaller than a great horned owl, and they prey adventitiously on Western Screech Owls, or they've been known to. They've been sort of scapegoated, whether or not it's 100% true, as some of the reasons for declines of spotted owls as well. So there's a lot of correlative evidence in these areas. So when the barred owls arrived in the 1960s and then started to increase, Western Screech Owl populations started to decrease at the time that the barred owls started to become quite abundant in the 90s and then early 2000s. And became very, very evident. So people thought, well, this has to be the story. This has to be everything. Barred owls showed up, they moved across the Rockies, and then they wiped out Western Screech Owls. I will leave that aside for now. We'll come back to that story in a second. But what I did in my end of my undergrad was ask some questions about screech owls that I think people haven't asked in the scientific literature before. And it asked whether or not there were screech owls up on the central coast and in some of the more remote island ecosystems that kind of look like the Southern Gulf Islands in structure, but habitat is quite different. Are there Western screech owls subsisting on those islands and fewer barred owls maybe? Are there screech owls out there and fewer barred owls coming in and wiping them out on these outer islands? And when I went up there in 2016, we found up top, can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Sweet, nice, great power. So this is the area of the survey around Bella Bella. We had 100% occupants, well, 80% occupancy in some habitat types up there for Western screech owls. And that same habitat types that were on these islands is also found on Northern Vancouver Island. And these are sort of low productivity, very old bog ecosystems. On Northern Vancouver Island, there was some transects with 100% occupancy, which means that birds were at every single location, Western screech owls in particular. And on those transects, you didn't tend to see barred owls. On the transects where the Western screech owls were, you didn't tend to see barred owls. And more recently, we started to do point counts and to do other types of surveys in some of these other areas on Northern Vancouver Island, like the Sitka and down in Carmanah. And I'll show you guys a map of our work afterwards. But we found similar densities of Western screech owls in these ecosystems as well. So you have a very high productivity cedar old growth forest in Carmanah and a very low productivity, very short, very stunted, not a lot of vegetation that gets very tall, these old growth bog ecosystems on Northern Vancouver Island and the Central Coast. And so when I say productivity, what I mean is basically, you can see that by how big the trees get when it's an old forest. So I'll show you an example in a second here. There we go. So this is some of the higher productivity, really big tree, old growth forest that remains on the island. And this is Sitka. And so we had over 80% occupancy. So at more than 80% of the sites, and then 100% occupancy here in some parts of Carmanah Walbran. This is a lot of Western screech owls in some of these habitats. And then we look at these habitats. On the left here, you can see somebody for scale, 6'3" human being. And on either side and behind him are very, very, very large cedars. This is an example of some old growth that's near Carmanah, Carmanah Walbran Provincial Park. And this is very high productivity old growth cedar. And this is on the right, a photograph from the Central Coast. It looks very similar to Northern Vancouver Island as well, but this is the low productivity bog ecosystem. Both of these habitats have Western screech owls more so than anywhere else that we know of, period. So these habitats, as you might notice, there are no deciduous trees in them. They're basically no deciduous trees. So there's not really any alder, there's not really any maple, but they still have the highest densities of Western screech owls that we know of. Now, the question of why are there screech owls in these weird different ecosystems kind of brings up, I think it's best answered if we say less so what they are and more so what they're not. This is a photograph from North Shore somewhere, Vancouver, of a early to mid-successional second growth hemlock forest. So if you cut either of these trees, either of these ecosystems down, more so on the left, you're going to get something along these lines that grows up. And if you compare this, you can see I've got it with snow on it so that you can tell what kind of sort of snow cover, variation in snow cover there is. Not a lot of light gets through, so not a lot of stuff grows underneath, but then it doesn't protect very well from snow cover. You can see here an ecosystem that has varying size of trees and variable canopy closure. You end up with all of this amazing undergrowth and all of these very tall salal and dense hemlocks that are just atrocious to walk through. And they also protect different areas and keep them snow-free in the winter, and they maintain moisture much better via a whole bunch of different sort of complex old growth system dynamics. So here's another good example. Got ourselves an old forest just underneath a log. If you were to cut around this creek, I really like, I'll go back and I'll look at this more specifically for Western Screech Owls. There are some really wonderful camera trap photos of Western Screech Owls right along the edge of creeks. And I've seen them in ditches and heard stories of people seeing them hunt chorus frogs on the side of the road, which is a dream of mine. I would love to see that. So when I came here, I decided that underneath this big log, you'd get a Western Screech Owl sitting somewhere like here and fishing for crayfish or caddisflies or fish or something. But if you take this sort of undergrowth diversity away, you end up with a one age of forest, and no longer do you have that diversity in habitat for Western Screech Owls to forage potentially or to avoid predation. So for example, if you were a barred owl and you were looking to try and catch something in the undergrowth, it's going to be a lot harder for you than it is for Western Screech Owls because you're much larger and you're going for squirrels and bushy-tailed wood rats and stuff like that. Anyway, so that's the story of the Western Screech Owl change in understanding of habitat and preferred habitat, and some speculations on what might be driving those things. So if we look at a photograph, an aerial image like this, because I talked a lot about Carmanah, this is Carmanah. You can see some of the areas being cut around it. If we were to look at this historically, we would think you might get a couple Screech Owls in here. But now we know, well, you would typically think that the Western Screech Owls were right down here at the bottom if they were going to be here. And we know that they're along the river a little bit, but they're much more common up on these slopes where there's a lot of cedar, a lot of old cedar that has a lot of really big undergrowth that helps them forage, maybe helps them avoid predation. These are the kind of questions that we're going to have to ask, exactly why this is happening. I guess would be a lot of different reasons too. Okay, so we've changed the way that we've understood Western Screech Owl habitat, but we still really I haven't told you guys about how we listen to the night and how we explore these kind of species at risk or otherwise. So for Western Screech Owls and for other organisms that make a lot of sound that we can hear, so it's not ultrasonic like bats, we can use it's a one-stop shop for a recording unit that you can put out in the forest, and it will record on a schedule that you decide. This is called an ARU, or an autonomous recording unit. If you hear automated recording unit, you can look at those people and say, that's not what it's called, but you also know what they're talking about. If you hear autonomous accordion unit, you're talking to my sister. Nobody ever says that, but that's what she calls them. I don't actually want to find out what that is, what it would look like. So these are a few different examples of different types of autonomous recording unit that you can get. So ARUs vary from this very large one here, the SM3, to the very small and much more affordable Audio Moth, and then sort of the mid-size and mid-affordability Song Meter Mini. And then the less said about the Cornell Lab units, the better. Don't buy those. So this is our setup. You put this out in the woods. It's like a trail. I often tell people it's like a trail cam for sound, but it's different in that you turn it on and it records for maybe an hour, and then it turns off for 10 minutes. Or you could say, I want you to turn on for 3 minutes, turn off for 12. Or I want you to record 7 minutes, then 3 minutes, then 2 minutes. The options are infinite. What we've been deciding to do is to try to keep it as simple as possible. And so we record 3-minute segments from just before sunset to just after sunrise. And that allows us to listen to Western Screech Owls throughout the night. So here's a good example of what happens when you take that data and you look at it and you listen to it. So this is sort of frequency of encounter of vocalizations. And then here we have different times. So sunset, middle of the night, and then sunrise. You can see here we have spotted owls are singing a lot more around sunset and sunrise than barred owls are. And they're singing much more consistently through the night. So that might mean a whole bunch of different things for behaviorally, but it also probably means a lot for your design of your study. If you were looking at spotted owls, maybe it's okay to survey at dawn and dusk. If you're looking at barred owls, you probably want something more in the middle of the night. But if you're looking at both, you're gonna need a larger sort of area of coverage, a much more consistent night-long recording schedule. The other wonderful thing about these recording units is that owls are not the only thing that make sound. So if you record from before sunset to after sunrise, you have a lot of audio to be able to explore different organisms, not just different behaviors, but to look for different species entirely. So band-tailed pigeons are a diurnal species. Northern goshawks also a diurnal species, and they will both be band-tailed pigeons. My guess is that they'll be very easily picked up. Goshawks, I don't know. Who knows? We'll find out if they're easy to monitor with ARUs, but there's just not a lot of them on the landscape. They're very, very sort of rare, and they don't tend to vocalize a ton. So we'll find out if we can survey for them. But you certainly can study these other nocturnal species as well. And these are all species at risk in British Columbia. And so people are interested in knowing what's going on with each of them. Instead of going ahead and starting your band-tailed pigeon project on your own, it's probably a good idea to, well, we think it's a good idea to look at all of these species together, or at least gather data that allows people to look at them individually. So here's an example of how one might set up a grid of ARUs. These odd shapes. So this is the Carmanah-Walbrand Valley. Here's your trailhead here. That's where the parking lot is, and there's a path that goes all the way up and down. There's a few different odd little shapes I've got going on in here, and this is sort of to explore the elevational variation in Western Screech Owls. And other owls and other wildlife in these systems. But for the most part, we have a transect that runs from down here all the way up the river. And you might want to pair that transect with something else that runs through a second growth forest or a different old growth forest or a city, and you'll run a similar transect through that and put an ARU at every one of those spots. And then those two samples are very easy to compare. Now, one of the things that you would then do is go and retrieve those units, take all of that data and put it into your computer, and using some visualization programs, something like Audacity that you can listen to or visualize at the same time, you will then listen to or visualize that audio. This is an example of two Western Screech Owls singing. So we have frequency on the left, or pitch, and time down here would be in seconds. But this is a male Screech Owl singing, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this is a female singing with him in Carmanah brand. And I got several emails over the summer telling me that they had the Western Screech Owl and Carmanah brand. Without fail, it was the same pair who were very, very rowdy. And we named them both Randy with an I and Randy with a Y, after Randy Stolzman. Anyway, that's not important. What is important is that these two birds are singing in a very odd way. They're singing while it's raining, and you can tell that it's raining here because of all these little sort of higher frequency lines up here. And that's a raindrop hitting something. It's almost like a clap sound, and it covers a bunch of different frequencies. So this tells us that these two birds are courting, that they probably have a nest in the immediate area, and that they don't mind singing when it's raining. So these sort of older ideas that, you know, owl surveys in the rain are not that effective might not be 100% true. But we can look at these kind of things. This might be anomaly, this might be consistent. This allows us to explore those kind of questions as well. So one of my very favorite things about acoustic data is that you can look at it in different ways. Each one of these little boxes here is a night, and the top is represented by, you don't have to know what they are, but the top is represented by a collection of different sort of sound types. And then the bottom is a bunch of different sound types as well, sort of sound descriptors. They're called acoustic indices. And so it might be loudness, or it might be complexity, but basically you have a bunch of different colors that end up meaning different things, but it's the entire night. So I can look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. I've got 20 nights of audio right here that I can just look at. Now imagine going back through, and this is about a second. So imagine this 30-second clip and having to go through all of that. It would be very, very, very slow if you have, let's say, 3 hours a night and 200 or 300 nights to process. On our side of things, we have thousands of nights to process. So instead of doing that, what I get to do is to visualize all of these nights and to take a look at them more specifically, and they'll show me exactly what's happening on that night. So here we have a lot of rain. This orange and green, it means rain. So I'm probably not going to process these nights with a whole bunch of wind and rain. We look down here, we have a bunch of wind, and yeah. The other thing that these visualizations can show you is Pacific chorus frogs. So Pacific chorus frogs, when they sing together in a chorus, it becomes very, very loud over a small band of frequencies. And it picks it up really, really well. It's not as good for picking up Western Screech Owls because they don't sing as loudly or as consistently. But if you want to know when the Screech Owls, you want to know when the chorus frogs are not singing so that you can hear absolutely anything else, then you can use this to go through and get rid of all those pesky coarse frogs in your way, keep you from listening to your good data. So the other method that we use for understanding where Western Screech Owls are and where they're not, and where other owls are and where they're not. Actually, I should go back. The other thing that you can do, and I should mention that we're doing this because people will get angry if I don't, specifically our bat collaborators, you do all of this with bats as well. So bat ARUs are built a little bit differently, but for the most part, they do the same thing, which is really cool because then you can actually listen to the bat songs and calls that you wouldn't be able to hear. Normally, they're brought down in frequency and you can actually hear and see them vocalizing, which I quite enjoy. So the other thing that we're doing is nocturnal playback surveys. And these have been done with different methods, sort of historically back till the 80s, maybe some of the early point counts that we have on the coast for Western Screech Owls and for other owls. But what we're doing is we're doing these at the same time as we're doing these ARU surveys. So I'll put out an ARU for 2 months and we'll do our point count playbacks at that location as well. And then we'll be able to understand how those two methods compare to each other if we get enough of a sample size. And that way we can tie our ARU methods with our point count methods down the road as well. And with everybody else's point counts as well. And that all of the historical point count data is now being brought into one location so that we can do sort of larger scale analyses with them. This is specifically for Western Screech Owls. You might think this is a very large project to manage. Yes, it is. It's getting bigger and it's very exciting. And it's been more than just myself and Toby, my collaborator, can do on our own. So we managed to get some funding to get people to help out and to be able to rent units and to be able to do the field work that we want to do. And one of the biggest parts of this entire project is building a long-term volunteer base. And so what we've been doing is doing talks like this, as well as putting out things online. We have a website, pacificmegascops.org. And this is basically a place where you'll see all of our different methods and any results as they pop up along the way, and blog posts from the season, photographs of the birds and that kind of stuff as they come out. Pacific Megascops, I think, is going to change. Even though we have shirts, my partners, it's just the same. Partners, brother and sister-in-law got Pacific Megascops shirts made. And now I think we might want to change the name. Pacific Megascops Research Alliance is what we're calling ourselves right now. And it's basically just what it says it is. It's a research alliance for people who want to study Western Screech Owls or Megascops in the Pacific Canadian region. So I think we'll actually probably end up changing that name down the road. But for now, we have PMRA as our preferred name. And this is the organization basically that manages all the volunteers and gets a lot of these surveys done. We haven't done it on our own. These are all of the collaborators that, or some at least of the collaborators that we've been working with, either reaching out and providing protocols or helping them process their data or getting data from them or collaborating to get out into the field at the same time. It's been incredibly helpful to be able to get funding and to be able to collaborate with groups that allow us to get access to some pretty amazing areas in coastal BC. So that's the presentation. I know that I've thrown a whole bunch of information at you. But if you have any questions about ARUs or Western Screech Owls or nocturnal ecology in BC, feel free to ask now or later as well. If you don't feel like you want to ask, or you think about it later, Pacific Megascops at gmail.com is our email. Oh, I'll put it on the chat because I didn't write it here. That's our email. And then feel free to email with any questions anytime. I check it more than I check my personal email.
Anybody have questions? No, but I have a lot of people on the
Okay. No, I don't know if I get one.
I have a question, more than a few questions, but I'm going to start with the first one. How do you recognize the shape of the sound of a specific species?
That's a really good question. That's the whole trick of audio processing. So the shape of each sound is going to change depending on how you stretch the frequencies or collapse them, or stretch the time or collapse that. But basically each species has its own distinct song structure that you can, in many cases, and in some cases you might not be able to distinguish from other species. So with Western Screech Owls, for example, they kind of just look like dots carrying a cross because they go. So they're these nice sort of dots at about 700 hertz. Now, if you were to maybe try to tell that apart from a Wilson snipe winnow, where they go, where oh, it's their tail feathers, isn't it? Yeah, it's their tail feathers vibrating, and they do this sort of winnowy call. If it's distant, it will look very similar to that, but it'll be slightly less consistent than it. But if it's close, it has a whole bunch of harmonics that stack on top. So if you were to go in looking for that, you might not be able to figure that out right off the bat. There's a lot of resources that sort of help you learn those differences between songs visually that you might not even be able to hear acoustically. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, because the big thing is the sound depends on the emitter, and the environment around the emitter is going to have different characteristics because of resonance and other things that happens with waves.
Yeah.
Okay, so they may be canceling each other at some point, or they may be amplifying themselves, or they may not change.
Yeah,
and all depends. Is just to give an example how close a bird that is singing is to a resonant box that resonates to that frequency singing. But if it's farther away, that the characteristic of that resonance is going to change.
Yeah, yeah. So it's you've delved into a question that has a set of fields that study these sort of issues with how sound travels through the landscape and how we pick up sound. So for a really good example, you might not want to have an ARU that has its own resonating characteristics. One of the ARUs that's recently come out onto the market has put the microphone inside the unit, and as sound comes in, it resonates within the box and then gets picked up on that microphone as altered sound waves. And it's just atrocious. It's horrifying. But so for areas where you might want to be able to survey for Western Screech Owls, they're often going to have a lot of water, creeks, that kind of stuff. That's going to mask your sound you know, whether environmental factors will mask and change that sound. And then depending on the forest structure and the landscape structure, you know, whether denser forests are going to have, you can't hear as far as you would in an open sort of grassland, or in a dry, you know, a pine forest or something like that. So those different structures of the landscape will also change how far you can hear from station to station. So it's really complicated. The great part about it is that most of these things are showing up in our own ears as well. But we don't actually have any of the tools that we might have from these recordings to be able to account for that variation, which is exciting and incredibly intimidating because it's complicated. So yeah, no, really good question. Yeah.
So I was wondering, you never really explained, did you think that it's a combination between habitat and barred owls, or because it's like on the coast here, at Great Blue Heron, there's been persisting Screech-Owl, say, and the habitat is really, really dense for them to hide in and stay away from the barred owl. So is it probably a combination, anybody you're thinking of the two, when as soon as it opens up, that for Screech-Owl doesn't have a chance? And that's what I had at my place. I had been breeding our pond, but it's a very open area because the road runs right next to where the box was, and they were doing well for a couple of years. And again, my first barred owls, and never again really in a Screech-Owl in the area, you know. And my friends had the same experience. As soon as a barred owl showed up, they had breeding there, and it was on, and that was it. And yet, you know, you must know Jerry, the old owl guy. Anyway, he told me that they were still breeding not that long ago on farther on north facing slope of Elk Mountain, I guess it would be, and in the promontory in that area. And I hadn't seen one on the hill for a long time. You know?
Yeah. I
used to get them all the time to find them dead on the road. They tend to fly really low. That was another major killer that I found. They fly really low across the roads, unlike some other birds. And well, the barn owls suffer from that as well. And I just threw out 2 bodies from Screech-Owls I had for decades. I found them in the bottom of the trees. Time to go.
It's a little echoey there, but did you say that there was, there are carcasses that exist?
Yeah, I just threw them out, in fact, yesterday, 2 out in the woods. I just threw them out. I cleaned out my deep freeze, and they were down in the bottom. You would want them?
Yeah, yeah, 100%.
Look for them maybe tonight or tomorrow morning.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, so and I think with roadkill, and that's where a lot of the diet studies come from. I know a lot of the diet work that's been done has been from roadkill freezer birds. The roadkill, I think it's because they just love hunting low. And I'm really interested to get some tracking devices on some birds for just a whole array of questions that we haven't answered in BC or in this subspecies, really, about movement and dispersal and territoriality and all these kind of things. But in particular, hunting height above the ground, they seem to hunt really low out on the coast here, especially beside roads. Presumably they're foraging, when it's raining, they're foraging for amphibians, and in particular taking advantage of maybe amphibian movements along the coast. With regards to the impacts of things like barred owls and habitat, I think a good analogy I would say it has to be both, but I would say if you have a cold snap and, oh man, now I should have prepped an analogy beforehand. Now my analogies are just absolutely atrocious. You got, let's say everybody's in tents. You're in tents. Let's say you got a new property. You're about to build a home. You want to put, heat pump in it. But currently you're in a tent. If it goes to -30, you're not going to be safe in your tent. You're going to be safe in your house. And the same thing's going to happen if you have a novel predator or a novel, a very cold winter or a very hot summer. If you're in an ecosystem that has those kind of structural and habitat buffers that allow you to persist, then you're going to be a lot better off. So in an old growth ecosystem where you have different types of shelter, different types, very, very quickly changing habitats, you can get to your pond that's going to be there all summer long. You can get to an area, maybe you're foraging a lot underneath the salal cover. And the barred owls, which are also there, are not going to be able to get to you. So it could easily be an impact from barred owls, food shortages, temperature snaps that all add together when the ecosystem changes. So if you clear cut an entire forest, that forest comes back up at the same age. If anything in that forest pressures you, then you're going to be much more susceptible to it than if you have a forest that's structurally incredibly complex. So that's sort of how I've been thinking about it, because really interestingly, we're finding barred owls and screech owls coexisting in old growth habitats. So barred owls seem to really love the riparian spruce stuff right along the edge of the rivers. And then screech owls seem to love a little bit upslope in the cedar, but they coexist from point to point in these old growth forests. And barred owls have been in these old growth forests for decades. So it seems like they're responding to these variables differently in the habitat. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool. Good question. It's a tough one. And I think as we gather more data and as we work with these different collaborations, we're getting a clear idea of what's going on. So yes, that question is to be answered continuously in the future.
About the two owls, if I find them, just phone you or what?
Yeah, I mean, send an email, phone, those points are going to end up helping no matter what. If you hear stories of screech owls, to anyone here, we're always looking to hear about it. I'm particularly curious about the areas up and behind Harrison Lake, where there's some patches of some older forest there. But anywhere in the area, if you're encountering birds, would love to hear about it for sure. Always valuable. Yes, sorry. Yeah, send me an email is best. Pacific Megascops at gmail.com. Yeah.
Jeremiah, are they all active only at night or just at thermal?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is the best time of night to hear their calls? Jeremiah, you throw it up.
We're not getting you.
Yeah, you're frozen. We can't hear you.
What happened there? Yeah.
Oh, just tell me that Pacific Megascops. There you
Oh, there we go.
go. There you go.
I think that was on my side. Yes, owls at night. They are entirely nocturnally active. Western Screech Owls are. And the time of night, sometimes they'll call during the day, but I think only really in like areas where there's just a ton of them and they do weird stuff. But you're going to get a lot more activity around March and April than at any other time of the year. In the fall, they'll pop up again. Somebody just had one up in Clackwood, one of my friends the other day, in the middle of the day, heard one singing. And I think they're establishing territories. Young ones are sort of roaming around trying to find territories, and the adults are saying, whoa, 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 occupied. So I think that's maybe what's going on this time of year. But the breeding season, when you have these amazing duets, and the best chance at hearing them is between March and the end of April. So beginning of March, end of April, peaking on the coast around end of March. And then a month on either side of that as well. And time of night is really interesting because we're picking them up a lot very late in the night, almost just before morning. And what seems to be going on is that they're having a lot of random vocalization periods through the night. Maybe not random, just because I don't see a pattern doesn't mean that it's random. But there's a lot of vocalizations through the night. Maybe when one of the pair has come back and bringing food and they just start doing their courtship. But sometimes you'll get a lot of activity just before sunrise as well, which is a tough one, right? I mean, if you're going to go out and look for owls, you don't want to get up stupid early and and go look for owls. You want to stay up late and go and look for owls. But you know, if you find yourself out pre-dawn, that's also a pretty good time for them as well.
So I have a question. How much continuous habitat size would they need? Because where they nested before at the Fox, it was a small little riparian area, field, and then forest up the hill, and then forest across the road, you know, 3-acre piece sort of thing.
Sure, it was
So
3 acres.
just wondering how big a space do they really need now that maybe the barred owls moved in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That is part of some of the research that's going to be going on that we are, I want to say we're advising on. Who knows? We're actually advising on it, but there is some research being done by the government coming up here in the next year that's going to be covering some of that. But I think with the data that we have, we could kind of explore some of those questions as well. We don't know. The long and the short answer would be we don't know. But if I was to speculate, if you are very close to good habitat, that, and we'll define good habitat as old growth cedar forest, or really any sort of old growth. But for now, old growth cedar forest, if you're really close to that and there's a small patch of that, you're probably going to get screech owls in there. A lot of the areas that we've been going to that have little sort of patches of forest remaining that might almost be like just a tiny copse of trees in the middle of a clear cut, but they're only a kilometer away from a huge patch of old growth. They're going to have screech owls in them. But as soon as you start to move further and further and further away, it might not even matter that you have a small patch of forest that's really good for screech owls because they're just not dispersing to that location. So my speculative answer to that would be you're gonna want probably at least 20 acres of good stuff. And that's just wild speculation with no background. Do not quote me. I will deny having ever said this. I know it's on film. I will still deny it.
I saw Audubon encouraging people to build owl boxes and put them up to the Western and Eastern Screech Owls. So that's why I was wondering if it nested there once, would it, maybe they're still around, and there's a park, Tom Park, not far from us.
Totally good idea.
Inviting Bardo for lunch or.
Right. I've got some screech boxes up at my granny's 10-acre farm on the island here, and some sawwhet boxes as well. There's 4 species of owls there. None of them are screech owls, but it's always worth trying, I think. And people are looking at, I wouldn't put all your hopes on boxes is all, because there's a lot of very interesting parts of these birds' lives that aren't taken into account by their nest location. They got to be able to survive there to nest there. But another interesting thing is the structure of the box. And I had never thought about this until somebody who's working with us actually is doing their thesis on it in the Okanagan, Megan Burrs. The thermoretentive properties. So heat and cold is less likely to, well, the temperature is less likely to fluctuate widely inside a large tree cavity versus inside a very thin-walled box. So if you get cold snaps, might be much more susceptible to that kind of thing. It might change your parasite load. It might change your survival rate in these sort of thin-walled boxes versus being in the middle of a large dead tree that has a lot of trunk in between you and the outside, sort of insulating, which is just something I never thought about, and I don't know why until like last year. So that's something we're looking into right now. I mean, not me, but someone else, and that'll be really interesting, and I think important to know. Having said that, I highly recommend putting up boxes. If not, just, even if it doesn't produce something screech-owly, maybe you get a wood duck in there, and at least you're feeling engaged. And I never want to like underestimate how important that is. I spent a lot of time looking for screech owls in Vancouver and not finding them, but still looking for them. And if I had sort of gotten miffed about it, I never would have sort of stumbled onto some of these exciting findings. So, if you can get boxes out there and get people excited and talking about it, even if no screech owl ever shows up, at least it starts that conversation and it keeps it in your mind. So, yeah. I'm sorry, it's a simple question, ridiculous answer, but that's my answer and I'm sticking to it.
I was wondering, I was, sticking to YouTube, and I saw one video where there's a woman and she puts a screech owl box, nails it right under her eaves on the house. And she's out there taking pictures of the screech owl. I don't know what kind or where the video's taken. And
wow.
Then bicycle handles and
They're so cool. There's very cool species of screech owls out there. There's the eastern screech owls, I think, are mostly the ones that you're going to encounter in urban environments. But I saw a video of a tropical screech owl, which is it's from Central and South America, big complex of different subspecies all throughout the Amazon and stuff, with a lizard on some dude's motorcycle in the middle of the night, in the middle of the city. I was like, well, why don't our Western screech owls do that? Like, we've got rats, we got motorcycles, like, come on down. But yeah, you never know. You might find a nomad that's just so stoked about an eaves box.
Any other questions? Okay, so well, thank you, Jeremiah. That was a great talk. We really enjoyed it. Learned a lot about the owl. Oh, and I should have asked about your volunteer opportunities.
Oh, yeah.
What you got your volunteers doing? Maybe you want to explain that to me too.
Yeah. If you're interested in doing any counts or working with ARUs or that's it. That's basically it. we've got a lot of opportunities and a lot of sort of space to cover in BC. And you know, we're working on developing a long-term volunteer monitoring program. And we can't do it without the volunteers. So if you guys are keen on exploring some areas or repeating some surveys in some areas, they don't need to be primo screech owl habitat. If you're excited to see if there's screeches there or not, then totally set something up there too. Just fire me an email and we would love to chat. Toby is my +1 on this, and he has done most of the lower mainland stuff. Some really exciting findings in places like Capilano River watershed and Golden Ears area. But we haven't stretched east from there. So if people are stoked and keen on this, then fire me an email and we will hit the ground running for the springtime.
Oh, okay, well, great. Great, thanks for everything.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Excellent. Thanks so very much, Jeremy.
No worries. Yeah, I thank you for all coming out and listen to me talk about sound and owls. I would do this by myself even if nobody was here. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Yeah, you too. Good night.
I don't know. Sure.